A 13-year-old girl lived alone after her parents passed away. She stunned her neighbors with an act they never saw coming. What could she have done? Emily's house stood at the edge of the mountains, its weathered stone walls bearing the weight of time and solitude. The winds of Galicia swept through the valley, carrying with them the damp chill of the season and the whispers of a life forever altered. Only 13, Emily lived alone in this fragile remnant of her past. 6 months had passed since her parents perished in a violent accident, leaving her to shoulder not only her grief, but also the responsibility of survival. She stood by the small window, her hands resting on its cold wooden frame. The view outside was somber, the rolling mist cloaking the mountains in a veil of indifference. Inside, the house bore traces of her parents' labor, simple furniture, a hearth blackened by years of use, and the tools of a life now silenced. Emily clung to these remnants as fiercely as she clung to her resolve. The townsfolk of Frankenmuth, while polite, were distant. Self-reliance was the rule here, and sympathy only extended so far. Yet, she refused to leave. A convent had been suggested, a place where orphaned girls could be cared for, but it would mean abandoning her home, and with it, the last vestiges of her family. This was not a sacrifice Emily was willing to make. Her days were a constant struggle, punctuated by the cold reality of her dwindling resources. The small garden behind the house yielded little, and the coins from selling crops had almost run dry. Winter loomed on the horizon, its icy grip threatening to choke what little hope remained. Still, Emily's spirit held firm. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Strength was born from adversity, and integrity was a treasure no hardship could steal. One afternoon, as Emily walked the dirt path toward the village, her eyes caught something unusual. Beneath the crisp layers of fallen leaves, a worn leather wallet glinted faintly in the light. She paused, crouching to retrieve it. Its surface was cracked and scuffed, evidence of its long journey. She opened it with careful hands, revealing a collection of bills, more money than she had ever seen in her life. Her breath hitched as she thumbed through the notes, her mind racing with possibilities. This money could sustain her through the winter, buy supplies and repair parts of the house. But beneath the cash lay a small identification card, its ink slightly smudged. Richard D., it read. Emily immediately recognized the name. Richard Dulake owned the modest restaurant in the village, a man respected for his hard work and generosity. She closed the wallet and gripped it tightly, her heart heavy with indecision. Her parents had instilled in her a deep sense of morality, the belief that one's character was defined not by ease, but by the choices made in difficult moments. And yet, the temptation gnawed at her. Was this not fate offering her a reprieve? By the time she reached her decision, dusk had begun to settle over the village. She approached the restaurant, its warm light spilling onto the cobblestone street. The sign above the door creaked gently in the breeze, and inside, the smell of baked bread and roasted meat wafted toward her. Emily hesitated, clutching the wallet as her fingers trembled. Then, summoning her courage, she pushed the door open. The small bell above the entrance jingled softly, drawing the attention of Richard Dulake, who stood behind the counter. He was an older man, his silver hair neatly combed and his eyes sharp but kind. He looked up from his ledger, his expression curious as Emily approached. "I found this," she began, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. She extended the wallet toward him. It was on the path leading to the village. Richard Dulake's brow furrowed as he accepted the wallet, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. He opened it, his face softening with recognition. "This. I must have dropped it earlier," he said, his voice tinged with gratitude. "You don't know how much this means to me." Emily nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I thought it best to return it." Emily nodded, her quiet nature making her words few. Her reserved demeanour was shaped by months of solitude and grief, yet the sincerity in Richard's smile seemed to ease her discomfort. "Thank you," he repeated, tucking the wallet safely into his pocket. "Not everyone would have done the same. What's your name?" "Emily," she said softly, pausing before adding, "Emily Carter." Richard's face shifted, his brows knitting with a subtle mix of recognition and empathy. "Ah, the Carter family. I heard about the accident. I'm so sorry for your loss. Your parents were good, hard-working folks." Emily's throat tightened as she fought back tears, nodding silently. The mention of her parents reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. She managed a faint, "Thank you," but her voice wavered. Richard leaned slightly forward, his tone shifting to one of gentle concern. "Do you have work, Emily? Somewhere you're earning a living?" Her response was immediate and disheartened. "I've been looking, but no luck so far." Richard fell into a brief silence, his gaze thoughtful. Then, with a small, reassuring smile, he made a decision. "Well, if you're willing to get your hands dirty, I could use some help around here. It's not much, but it's honest work, and I think you'd do just fine." Emily's eyes widened in surprise. The idea of steady work, even in a modest diner, was a glimmer of hope she hadn't dared to expect. Without hesitation, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Dulake. I really appreciate this." Richard chuckled, waving off her formality. "No need for that. Just call me Richard. Life can be tough sometimes, but there's always a way through it. I can see the same resilience in you that I saw in your folk." For the first time in months, Emily felt a flicker of hope take root. While the ache of loss lingered, the opportunity offered her a sense of purpose, a small but significant step forward. The next morning, Emily rose before dawn. The cold mountain air seeped through the cracks of her modest home, but she ignored the chill. A sense of anticipation replaced her usual weariness. She spent the previous evening tidying her house, making sure everything was in place before she stepped into this new chapter. Donning a simple cotton dress that had once belonged to her mother, Emily felt a bittersweet connection to her past. As she walked the dirt path toward town, the crisp morning air filled her lungs. The sky was heavy with grey clouds, yet her spirit felt lighter. This job wouldn't solve all her problems, but it was a start, a chance to prove her worth, and perhaps carve out a path to a better future. When she arrived, the diner's door was slightly ajar, the warm glow of light spilling onto the quiet street. Inside, Richard was organizing papers behind the counter, the faint aroma of coffee wafting through the air. He looked up and smiled as he saw her. "Emily," he greeted, standing up and setting aside the papers. "You're early. That already says a lot about you." "I wanted to make sure I was here before the place opened," she replied, her voice tinged with shyness. "That's a good habit in this business," Richard said with a nod, gesturing toward a small storage area in the back. "Come on, I'll show you where we keep everything and what you'll be working on today." Emily followed him, her eyes taking in the details of the diner as they walked. The walls were adorned with black and white photographs of the town from decades past, and the cozy scent of lingering baked goods made the space feel welcoming. It was clear that Richard had poured his heart into this place. In the back, Richard patiently explained her first tasks: cleaning tables, organizing the pantry, and eventually helping prepare simple dishes. Though the sheer volume of information initially felt overwhelming, Emily quickly found a rhythm. The physical nature of the work, while exhausting, brought her a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in months. By the end of the day, her hands were tired, but her heart felt lighter. The diner, with its steady hum of customers and sense of purpose, had given her a glimpse of stability in a life that had felt so adrift. As she left that evening, the warmth of Richard's parting words stayed with her. "Keep at it, Emily. You've got the grit to make it." For the first time, she believed him. Emily's days followed a steady rhythm, one that gave her a sense of purpose and kept her mind occupied. As the morning unfolded, she worked diligently in the restaurant owned by Richard Dulake, the kindly old man who had recently offered her a job. Most of the early customers were local farmers and ranchers, folks who had known Richard for decades. They greeted Emily with polite nods or curious glances as news of her new position began to ripple through the small town of Ashford Hills. The town wasn't large, and Emily knew it wouldn't be long before everyone knew she was working at the restaurant. The tasks were demanding: washing dishes, wiping down tables, and hauling bags of flour, but Emily found a quiet satisfaction in being useful. By mid-morning, her initial nervousness had faded, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. She moved around the dining area with growing confidence, her focus sharp as the lunch rush began. The restaurant soon filled with the hum of conversations and the clinking of cutlery. Richard, ever the attentive proprietor, kept a watchful eye on Emily as she navigated the crowd. His wrinkled face softened with pride when he saw her determination and care. During a brief pause, he leaned in and said, "You're doing a great job, Emily. You remind me so much of your parents, always hard-working and honest." Emily's chest tightened at his words. Gratitude mingled with the ache of her loss, but she managed a small smile. Despite the ever-present shadow of her grief, she felt a glimmer of hope that this job might help her regain her footing. By the end of the day, after the last customers had left and the restaurant was quiet, Richard approached her with an envelope in hand. "Here's your first paycheck," he said, his voice warm with approval. "I know it's just your first day, but you've earned this." Emily accepted the envelope with a quiet, "Thank you," her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. Her eyes widened. It was more than they'd agreed upon, and for a moment she was at a loss for words. "Mr. Dulake, I think there's been a mistake," she said, holding out the envelope. "This is more than what we discussed." Richard's expression softened, and he shook his head gently. "It's no mistake, Emily. You're an honest young woman, just like your parents were. You remind me of someone very dear to me." His voice grew quieter, and Emily noticed a flicker of emotion in his eyes. Her curiosity was piqued, but she hesitated to press him. Finally, she asked softly, "Who do I remind you of?" For a moment, Richard seemed lost in thought. Then, with a deep sigh, he said, "My daughter, Mary. Years ago, we had a falling out and she left. I haven't heard from her since." The pain in his voice was unmistakable, and Emily felt a pang of empathy. Though their losses were different, she understood the weight of absence. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, unsure of what else to say. Richard wiped a tear from his cheek and offered her a sad smile. "Not a day goes by that I don't think about her. Seeing you reminded me of her, your honesty, your determination. It's like having a piece of her back." Emily was deeply moved. She felt a growing sense of responsibility toward Richard, not just as an employee, but as someone who shared a bond forged by loss. "Thank you for this opportunity, Mr. Dulake," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It means more to me than you know." He nodded knowingly. "I understand, Emily. I really do." The days passed swiftly. Emily worked long hours without complaint, and a mutual respect grew between her and Richard. He treated her with kindness, almost like a surrogate daughter. In quiet moments after closing, they would sit together, talking about life in Ashford Hills or sharing stories from his past. Despite the years separating them, their shared pain brought them closer in ways neither could fully explain. Yet, Emily's struggles persisted. The extra money helped, but it wasn't enough to cover all her expenses. Her home remained in disrepair, and with winter fast approaching, the thought of surviving the brutal cold weighed heavily on her mind. She often wondered how she would manage when the first snow blanketed the town and temperatures plunged. One evening, as she walked home after a long shift, she noticed something unusual. The house next door, which had been empty for months, now had its door slightly ajar. Emily hadn't seen anyone move in, but it was clear someone had arrived recently. Her curiosity got the better of her. Though it was late, she approached the house cautiously. As she reached the entrance, faint voices drifted out, confirming her suspicions. She paused, her heart quickening, and strained to listen. Emily hesitated, feeling a twinge of discomfort. Before she could turn back, a slender figure appeared in the doorway. It was a young girl, no older than 12, with dark hair and somber, wide eyes. Emily offered a soft smile, trying to ease the tension. "Hi, I'm your neighbor," she said, attempting a friendly tone. "I noticed your door was open and thought I'd introduce myself." Before the girl could reply, a young man stepped into view behind her. He looked to be in his early 20s, his tired features softened by a warm smile. "Hello," he greeted. "I'm Thomas, and this is my little sister, Clara. We just moved in." Emily felt a pang in her chest as she looked at them. There was something hauntingly familiar in Thomas's expression, a sadness and weight of responsibility she recognized all too well from her own reflection since her parents' passing. "It's nice to meet you both," she replied, returning his smile. Though she couldn't know it at that moment, this encounter would mark the beginning of a new chapter in her life, one where she wouldn't be as alone as she had thought. Thomas and Clara bore a burden that mirrored her own struggles, hinting at hardships they had endured. That night, as Emily prepared for bed, thoughts of the siblings lingered in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to help them, though she wasn't sure how. The next morning, as the first light painted the horizon in warm hues, she made up her mind. Before heading to work at the diner, she stopped by the small grocery store in town. With the little money she had, she bought some food, bread, beans, and a bit of cheese. It wasn't much, but she hoped it would offer some relief, even if only briefly. Bundling the groceries into a basket, she walked briskly toward the Dulake house, the morning chill biting at her cheeks as she clutched the basket close. When she arrived, the door was slightly ajar again, as though the home itself awaited her return. Emily knocked gently, and this time Thomas answered. His dark eyes seemed even wearier than the day before, but his smile remained steady. "Emily, hi," he said with a faint grin. "Hi," she replied, mirroring his smile. "I brought some food. I thought it might help a little." Thomas's eyes softened as he noticed the basket she held. "You didn't have to do this," he said, though his voice betrayed his gratitude. "I wanted to," she insisted. "Please, take it." As she stepped inside, Emily took in the small, modest home. It was not much larger than hers, and though it felt cozy, the air inside was heavy. In the corner of the room lay a frail woman on a simple bed, her face pale and her eyes closed. Clara sat in a chair beside the bed, but when she saw Emily and the basket of food, her face lit up with a joy that momentarily pierced the somber atmosphere. "Thank you," Clara exclaimed, her smile a bright contrast to the sadness that seemed to envelop the house. Emily set the basket on a small table and sat down beside Thomas. Grateful, he began to explain their situation, though Emily had already sensed much of it. Their mother, Maria, had been gravely ill for months. The family had moved to this small town, hoping for a quieter life away from the challenges they had left behind. "Our dad left years ago," Thomas said quietly, his voice tinged with bitterness. "He couldn't handle the debts and turned to drinking. After that we were on our own." Emily nodded silently, her heart heavy as she listened. "My mom needs surgery," he continued. "The doctors said it's urgent, but we don't have the money. I would work if I could, but someone has to stay with Clara and Mom." Emily felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew all too well the weight of responsibility that came with losing parents and trying to carry on with little to no resources. For a moment, she remained silent, her mind racing for a solution. "I'll help you," she said finally, her voice firm with resolve. Even she was surprised by her own determination. "I'll do whatever I can to make sure your mum gets the care she needs." Thomas looked at her, startled but deeply grateful. "I don't know what you could do, but thank you, Emily. It means so much that you care." Emily smiled, though her thoughts were already racing. She didn't know exactly how she would help, but she was certain she couldn't stand by and do nothing. As she worked her shift at the diner that day, her mind remained preoccupied with the Dulac family's troubles. The weight of their struggle mirrored her own, and she couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt a spark of purpose, and she was determined to see it through. Emily couldn't stop thinking about the Fern family's situation. The weight of their struggles loomed in her mind as she worked through her shift at the restaurant, clearing tables and greeting the few diners who came in that evening. By the time her shift ended and the fading light of the sunset painted the horizon with soft oranges and reds, she knew she had to act. The family was on the brink of collapse, and Emily believed she might have a chance to help. She hesitated briefly outside Richard Dulac's office before stepping inside. The older man, seated behind his desk with a pile of receipts and ledgers, glanced up as she entered. His warm, inviting tone greeted her as always. "Emily, what brings you here so late?" he asked, setting his papers aside. Emily took a deep breath, her hands gripping the edges of her apron. She didn't want to seem desperate, but the urgency of the situation left her no choice. "Mr. Dulac," she began, her voice steady but quiet. "I need to ask you for a favor. A big one." Richard's brow furrowed slightly, concern flashing across his face. "What is it, Emily? Tell me what's going on." She explained everything, the mother's illness, the lack of money for the surgery, and how Tom struggled to care for both his sister Clara and their mother. Her words came slowly at first, but as she spoke, the desperation she had held back seeped into her voice. "I was wondering if you might lend me the money," she said, her hands trembling. "I'd pay it back little by little with my wages. I know it's asking a lot, but I'll do whatever it takes." Richard didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her closely, his silence stretching for what felt like an eternity. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she braced herself for his answer. She knew he'd already done so much for her, offering her a job when she had no other options. Asking for more felt almost impossible, yet she couldn't ignore the family's plight. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice calm and empathetic. "Emily," he began, leaning back in his chair, "you don't need to worry about paying me back. I've been through tough times myself, and I understand what it means to see someone you love suffer. I'll help this family, not because you asked me, but because it's the right thing to do." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with gratitude. It wasn't just the act of generosity that moved her, but the deep sense of understanding and compassion Richard showed. a reflection of values she herself held dear. Richard stood and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "No need to thank me," he said softly. "Sometimes people cross paths for reasons we can't see at first. I think you're here in this town for something greater than you realize." Emily left the restaurant with a lightness she hadn't felt in months. She ran toward the Ferns' modest home, her heart pounding with anticipation. Clara was sitting on the porch, her small frame illuminated by the porch light. As Emily approached, the young girl stood, her expression curious. "Emily?" Clara called out, her voice tinged with worry. "What's wrong?" Emily, breathless from her run, crouched down to meet the girl's gaze. A wide smile broke across her face as she spoke, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've found the money for your mum's surgery," she said. "She's going to be okay." Clara's eyes widened in disbelief before she threw herself into Emily's arms. "Really? Is it true?" she cried, her small arms tightening around Emily's neck. Hearing the commotion, Tom stepped out from the house, his face etched with exhaustion and worry. Seeing the tears in Emily's eyes and the joy radiating from Clara, he asked cautiously, "Is it true? Did you really?" Emily nodded, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "Mr. Dulake will take care of everything." For the first time since Emily had met him, Tom's expression softened with hope. His weary eyes seemed to shine with a renewed light. That night, the Ferns' house felt less burdened by sorrow. For the first time in what seemed like forever, kindness had found its way into their lives. Emily walked home, her steps slower now, her heart lighter than it had been in months. The grief that had shadowed her since her parents' death didn't feel as overwhelming. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that the future might hold something brighter. Over the next few days, preparations for the surgery moved quickly. The hospital confirmed that the funds had been received and the operation was scheduled without delay. Emily marveled at how swiftly everything had fallen into place. Whenever she saw Tom or Clara, she noticed a change in them. Though still worried, their faces held a spark of hope. The morning before the surgery, Emily stopped by the Ferns' house on her way to work. She wanted to make sure they had everything they needed for the day ahead. For the first time, she felt a quiet assurance that things might truly get better, not just for the Ferns, but for herself as well. Tom welcomed Emily with a weary smile, his face still etched with the tension of what lay ahead. "How are you holding up?" he asked, as they both settled onto the wooden porch. The view stretched out before them, rolling hills bathed in the soft light of morning. Tom took a deep breath, his gaze drifting toward the modest house where his mother was finally resting peacefully, thanks to the medications she'd received at the hospital. "I'm relieved in part," he admitted, not taking his eyes off the door, "but also on edge. Everything's happened so fast. Sometimes I wonder if this is real, if we can actually get through this." Emily nodded, her expression steady. "It's real, Tom. Your mom is getting the chance she needs to recover. There's still a lot to face, but you have to believe that things can get better." Tom turned to look at her, his smile now carrying a rare glimmer of hope. "I don't know how to thank you, Emily. If it weren't for you, I don't know what we would have done. We barely even know each other, and yet you've already changed my life for the better." Emily shifted slightly, feeling the weight of his gratitude. For her, the choice to help had been instinctive. She knew too well the isolation of facing hardship without support. Helping the Dulac family felt natural, almost inevitable. "You don't need to thank me," she said softly. "We all go through tough times. Helping each other, that's all we've got." For a moment, the two sat in silence, taking in the tranquil surroundings. In the distance, birds chirped, and the breeze carried the faint rustle of leaves. It was a rare moment of peace amidst the chaos. The stillness was broken by the gentle creak of the front door. Clara stepped out, still groggy from sleep, and joined them on the porch. "Is everything ready for tomorrow?" the young girl asked, her voice laced with curiosity and concern. Emily gave a reassuring nod. "Everything's set. Your mum will be taken to the hospital early in the morning, and the doctors will handle everything." Clara sat beside Emily, resting her head on her shoulder. Despite her young age, she grasped the seriousness of the situation. Yet in Emily, she had found someone she could lean on, someone who felt like more than a stranger. "Thank you for everything you've done," Clara murmured softly. Emily gently stroked Clara's hair, saying nothing, but feeling a quiet bond forming. In her heart, she realized she needed Clara as much as Clara needed her. Somehow, this connection had reignited a sense of family Emily thought she'd lost forever. The following morning, the first rays of sunlight peeked over the hills as the time came to take Tom and Clara's mother to the hospital. The Dulakes didn't have their own transportation, but a neighbor, a kindly older man who had known Richard Dulake for years, volunteered to drive them in his old pickup truck to the nearest city hospital. The ride was long and mostly silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of gravel beneath the tires. Tom held his mother's hand tightly as she slept deeply under the influence of painkillers. Clara sat close to Emily, who had insisted on accompanying them. She wasn't family, but she felt it was where she belonged during such a pivotal moment. When they arrived, the hospital stood in stark contrast to the small homes of their rural community. Its modern, clean lines and bustling atmosphere were almost overwhelming. Doctors and nurses immediately took charge of Tom's mother, whisking her away for preparation. The surgery was scheduled for later that afternoon, and the hours that stretched before them felt endless. The three waited together in the sterile, white-walled waiting room, the muffled sounds of hospital staff creating a constant backdrop. Tom, trying to be strong for Clara, couldn't entirely mask his anxiety. His hands trembled, and every tick of the clock seemed to deepen the lines of worry on his face. "It's going to be okay," Emily said gently, though she too felt the weight of uncertainty. Life had shown her too many farewells, and the fear of losing someone else loomed large in her mind. As the afternoon light began to fade, painting the sky in soft hues of orange, a doctor emerged from the operating room. His face was serious, but his eyes carried a subtle glimmer of relief. Tom, Clara, and Emily rose to their feet, their breaths held in unison as they waited for the news that would shape their future. "The procedure was successful," the doctor said, his voice steady yet warm. "Your mother needs rest and ongoing care, but her chances of a full recovery are strong." Emily, Thomas, and Clara exchanged glances, their disbelief gradually giving way to relief. Weeks of worry and sleepless nights now seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the glimmer of hope. Thomas rose quickly, shaking the doctor's hand with tears welling up in his eyes. "Thank you. Thank you so much," he managed, his voice breaking with emotion. Emily and Clara embraced, their shared tears reflecting the weight that had been lifted from their shoulders. Though they knew a long road of recovery lay ahead, this moment felt like a blessing. Over the following days, their mother began to heal. She remained under close observation at the hospital while Thomas and Clara visited daily. Emily, however, continued her work at Richard Dulake's restaurant. Richard, an older gentleman with a quiet authority, had become a steady presence in Emily's life. He often asked about her mother's condition with genuine concern, his words carrying a paternal warmth that touched Emily deeply. One evening, as they closed the restaurant after a busy day, Richard called Emily into his office. "Emily," he began, shuffling through a stack of papers on his desk, "I want to thank you. Because of you, this family has a second chance. If you hadn't stepped in, things might have turned out very differently." Emily flushed, caught off guard by his gratitude. "I just did what I thought was right," she said softly. "They didn't deserve to face this alone." Richard nodded, setting the papers aside. His usually calm eyes seemed to shimmer with an emotion Emily couldn't quite place. "Sometimes," he said, leaning back in his chair, "people come into our lives for reasons we can't immediately understand. In your case, I don't think it's a coincidence you ended up in this town or that you returned my wallet when you did." A shiver ran down Emily's spine at his words. They resonated with her in a way she couldn't explain. "Maybe," she replied hesitantly, unsure of what else to say. Richard smiled faintly but didn't press further. The silence between them was comfortable, as though both trusted that time would reveal whatever needed to be understood. A few days later, as Emily was serving the last customers at the restaurant, Thomas burst through the door. His hurried steps and the tension on his face immediately caught her attention. He walked straight toward her, ignoring everyone else. "Emily, can we talk?" he asked, his voice slightly breathless. She nodded, motioning for him to follow her to the back of the restaurant where they could speak privately. "What's going on, Thomas? You seem anxious." Thomas exhaled, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a photograph, worn at the edges and faded with time. The image showed a young couple on what appeared to be their wedding day. The woman, dressed simply in white, radiated joy, her face glowing with happiness. The man beside her wore a dark suit and a look of quiet pride and love. "This is the only photo my mum gave me before her surgery," Thomas explained, handing it to Emily. "She's kept it for as long as I can remember, but she never told me much about the man in it. She only said he was someone important from her past." Emily studied the photo closely. The woman, though younger and livelier, was clearly Thomas's mother. But the man, there was something eerily familiar about him. Her heart skipped a beat as a thought began to form, even before she could fully articulate it. "Have you shown this picture to anyone else?" she asked, returning it to Thomas with care. He shook his head. "No, only to you. Mum was too sick to share any details before the operation, but something in the way she looked at this picture made me think this man could matter to us somehow." Emily took a deep breath, aware that her next words could shift everything. "I think you should show this photo to Richard Dulake." Thomas frowned, clearly puzzled. "Why? Do you think he knows him?" "I'm not sure," Emily admitted slowly, "but there's something about that man in the photo. He feels familiar to me, and I can't stop thinking about what Richard said to me a few days ago. I think it's worth asking him." Thomas hesitated, his uncertainty evident, but after a moment he nodded. "All right," he said. "I'll talk to him." The next morning, after a restless night consumed by thoughts of the photograph, Thomas resolved to visit Richard Dulake's restaurant. Emily had encouraged him, and though uncertainty lingered, he felt compelled to follow his instincts. Upon entering the small, bustling eatery, Thomas immediately spotted Richard, seated behind the counter and focused on his usual morning task of balancing the books. As the doorbell jingled, Richard looked up, greeting Thomas with a warm smile. "Thomas, how are you, son? And how's your mother holding up?" His tone was genuinely concerned, reflecting the kindness he was known for. "She's doing better, Mr. Dulake, thank you," Thomas replied with a tentative smile before pulling out the photograph. "I wanted to show you something." Richard leaned forward, intrigued, and carefully took the picture. At first his expression showed mild curiosity, but as his eyes scanned the faces in the photograph, his demeanor shifted. His hands began to tremble, and his warm, steady gaze filled with shock and suppressed emotion. "This photo," Richard murmured, barely audible, as though the image had transported him back in time, his voice caught in his throat. "It can't be." The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the muffled clatter of dishes from the kitchen. Thomas watched as the color drained from Richard's face, and his hands clutched the photograph with a mix of disbelief and yearning. For several long moments, Richard seemed unable to tear his gaze away, as if the picture held the key to a past he thought was long buried. "Do you know the woman in this photo?" Thomas asked cautiously, his voice soft but insistent. Richard lifted his eyes, glistening with unshed tears. "I know her very well, son. She's my daughter, Maria." Thomas froze, the words hitting him like a thunderclap. His mother, the woman he had been so close to losing, was the long-lost daughter of Richard Dulake. The revelation left him reeling. Richard, seeing the confusion and disbelief on Thomas's face, began to explain. "Maria," Richard began, his voice breaking under the weight of his emotions. "She left home many years ago. We had a terrible argument, and she married a man I couldn't accept. After that, she disappeared from my life. I searched for her for years, but never found her." Thomas's breath hitched as the puzzle pieces began to fall into place. "The man in the photo, is he my father?" Richard nodded slowly. "Yes. I recognize him, though I didn't see him often. I always regretted not supporting Maria's decision, but after she left, all I could do was hope for the day I'd hear from her again." The weight of the revelation bore down on both of them. For Richard, it was an unexpected bridge to a past he had long mourned. For Thomas, it was the shocking realization of a family bond he had never known. "So that means," Thomas stammered, struggling to process the news. "Clara and we're your grandchildren." Richard's face softened as tears spilled freely down his cheeks. Setting the photograph aside, he rose slowly and walked over to Thomas, embracing him tightly. "That's right, son. I can hardly believe it. After all these years, life has brought me back to my daughter, and now to you." Overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment, Thomas returned the embrace, feeling a profound shift within himself. It was as if an unseen puzzle had suddenly revealed its shape, with pieces falling neatly into place. That afternoon, Richard decided to visit Maria at the hospital. Emily, deeply moved by the reunion, insisted on accompanying them. Richard's anticipation was palpable, but so was his nervousness. After so many years apart, he had no idea how Maria would react to seeing him, or if she would want to see him at all. When they arrived at the hospital, Richard's steps were unsteady, his hands gripping Emily and Thomas for support. The walk to Maria's room was marked by silence, broken only by the rhythmic hum of hospital equipment. At the door, Richard paused, inhaling deeply as if summoning every ounce of courage. Emily gave his arm a gentle squeeze. "It's going to be okay," she whispered, with an encouraging smile. Taking one last deep breath, Richard pushed the door open. Maria lay on the hospital bed, her face pale but her eyes alert. At first, she didn't recognize the man standing before her, but when their gazes locked, something flickered, a spark of recognition that brought a faint glow to her weary expression. "Dad." Maria's voice was a soft whisper, trembling with disbelief. Richard, tears streaming down his face, approached her bedside and took her hand in his heart aching yet mending all at once. "Maria, my sweet girl," he choked out, his voice thick with emotion. "I've waited so long for this moment. I've missed you more than words can say." Maria's tears flowed freely as she clasped her father's hand with what little strength she had. "I'm so sorry, Dad. So sorry for leaving like I did." "None of that matters now," Richard said, leaning down to embrace her gently. "The only thing that matters is that we're here together again." Emily, Thomas, and Clara, watching from the doorway, couldn't hold back their tears. After years of pain and separation, the family was finally whole again. In the days that followed, the hospital became a place of healing, not just for Maria, but for a family finding hope and renewal in one another. Richard Dulake, having reunited with his daughter Maria and discovered his grandchildren, felt like a man reborn. The life he thought he had lost decades ago had returned, filling his days with a newfound sense of purpose. Though Maria was still recovering from her surgery, simply having her father by her side gave her the strength she so desperately needed. For Thomas and Clara, learning about their connection to Richard had been overwhelming at first. Not only did they discover that their mother had kept such a significant secret for years, but now they also had a grandfather who, in many ways, filled the void their own father had left. What began as a chance encounter between Emily and the Dulake family had transformed into a story of family, redemption, and love. Though Emily wasn't related to them by blood, she felt deeply connected to their lives. After losing her parents, she had experienced a profound loneliness, but over time, she realized the bonds she had formed with the Dulake family had given her more than just a sense of duty. They had restored her feeling of belonging and given her people to rely on when she needed it most. A few weeks after the surgery, Maria was finally discharged from the hospital. Still fragile but improving, her recovery brought hope to everyone around her. Richard, who had not left her side even for a moment, decided it was best for Maria, Thomas, and Clara to move into his home. His house was modest but spacious enough to accommodate the entire family. "This is where we'll start fresh," he said one afternoon, helping Maria settle into her new room. "We've lost so much time, but I'm determined to make up for it." Maria looked at him with a mix of gratitude and nostalgia. The years apart had been long and painful, but her father's love had never wavered. "Dad, thank you for never giving up on me," she said softly. "I know I made mistakes, and for the longest time I thought you wouldn't love me anymore." "Never," Richard said, taking her hand in his. "I have always loved you, and I always will. What matters now is that we're together again." Their reunion had begun to heal wounds that ran deep, not just Maria's, but Richard's as well. For so many years he had carried the burden of regret, but seeing his daughter again and having his grandchildren under one roof felt like a miracle he had never dared to hope for. Life in the small town of Bedford Falls also started to shift for everyone involved. News of Richard's reunion with his family spread quickly, and neighbors who had once watched events unfold from a distance began to view the Dulake family in a new light. Even those who had been skeptical or distant now offered support, recognizing the strength that came from unity and mutual aid. Emily, who had stood by the Dulakes from the beginning, felt her own transformation. Each day her bond with Thomas grew stronger. From the moment they first met, their connection had been easy and natural. Now, after everything they had endured together, it was clear their lives were deeply intertwined. One sunny afternoon, As they strolled through the open fields on the outskirts of town, Thomas suddenly stopped. Turning to her with a smile she had come to know well, a mix of admiration and sincerity, he spoke. "Emily, I don't know where we'd be without you," he said earnestly. "You didn't just give us hope. You gave us a new chance at life." Emily looked at him, her heart warming at his words. "You and your family did the same for me, Thomas. Before I met you all, I was completely alone. Helping you felt like helping myself, and I'm grateful I could be there for you." Thomas reached out and gently took her hand. Their fingers intertwined naturally, as though they had always belonged together. "I can't imagine my life without you," he said, his voice steady and full of emotion. "You've been a light in our darkest moments, and I can't picture a future where you're not by my side." Emily felt her cheeks flush slightly at his words. Her heart raced, not out of nervousness, but with the certainty that what was blossoming between them was genuine. She knew the love they were beginning to share was as unshakable as the hills surrounding Bedford Falls. "I don't either," Emily whispered with a smile. "I can't imagine a future without you." A year after her life-changing surgery, friends and family gathered at the quaint little church in the heart of their town to celebrate Emily and Thomas's wedding. The entire community buzzed with excitement for the occasion. Though modest in size, the church was adorned with wildflowers hand-picked from the nearby hills. The day was bright and warm, with a gentle breeze carrying the earthy scent of freshly cut grass. Emily, dressed in an elegant yet understated white gown, walked arm in arm with Richard Dulake, who had become a father figure to her. For Richard, the moment carried a weight of profound emotion. Standing at the altar with Thomas, Emily represented not just the promise of a joyful future, but also the healing of a family once fractured by loss. For Richard, this wasn't merely about giving Emily away. It was about embracing the gift of newfound love and purpose. In her, he had rediscovered the joy of protecting and caring for someone who felt like family. When Thomas and Emily locked eyes, there were no second thoughts, no lingering fears. Their journey, filled with challenges and unwavering support, had led them to this moment. The love and gratitude they felt were evident in every glance, every quiet smile exchanged. As the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted into applause. Clara, their niece, was the first to race toward them, wrapping her arms around Emily and Thomas with a joyful laugh that melted hearts. The celebration continued at Richard's restaurant, where he stood to give a speech that left everyone wiping away tears. "Looking at my daughter, my grandchildren, and this incredible young woman who has brought us all together, I can only say, never give up hope," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Life has a way of pulling us apart, but it also has a miraculous way of bringing us back together. Sometimes those moments come when we least expect them, all because someone walks into our lives and changes them forever. Emily, you've been a blessing to us all, and I can't imagine this family without you." As he finished, Emily hugged him tightly, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. Around them, the crowd cheered and clapped, moved by the sincerity of his words. She knew, without a doubt, that this was her family now, a family she had never dared to dream of having again. Life in the small American town continued, but now it hummed with a fresh vibrancy. The Dulake family, once marked by loss and grief, had found new strength and love. Emily, who once believed her life would wither away after the loss of her parents, had become the heart of this family. Together, they had triumphed over loneliness and sorrow with love, resilience, and hope. The winds that once carried whispers of hardship now spoke of a future brimming with happiness and promise. Between the rolling hills and golden sunsets, The echoes of pain faded, replaced by the laughter of a family united by compassion and gratitude. And that's the incredible story of a young girl who, despite her loss and solitude, managed to shock and inspire an entire community with her actions. Life often tests us in ways we can't predict, but it's in those moments that true character shines through. What did you think of her journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. Don't forget to like this video if it moved you, and make sure to subscribe for more stories that touch the heart and leave you thinking. Until next time, take care and remember, even in the toughest times, kindness and courage can change everything.